This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. The show begins with the cattle market update from Elliott Dennis, University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist, as he discusses fed cattle, packers, retail, and labor concerns. K-State wheat specialist Sarah Ganske continues today's show as she explains controlling volunteer corn and the discontinuation of a herbicide for growers. Joe Gerken, K-State fisheries and aquatics extension specialist, ends today's show as he talks about pollinator strips and what they provide for the land and wildlife. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. Elliott, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Elliott, looking at the market, what are we seeing for fed cattle?
We've seen quite the divergence between the cash market and the CME futures this past week. Seen quite a bit of sell-off that really started about 10 days ago, the Friday of the preceding week, and then this kind of continued on Monday, and then things kind of rallied back up. And then after that rally, through the midweek, we were pretty strong. And then just things just started wheels started falling off towards the end of the week. Thursday, Friday, just large concerns about, really I'd call it speculation in the market about different meetings that were happening and different potential policies. And then at the same time, we've seen just really strong prices, particularly here in Nebraska and really the Northern Plains, South Dakota, just really, really strong prices, on really tight cattle supplies. And we think about where we are generally at, the tightest within a calendar year. This May, June are our tightest months already. And then you couple that with where we're at just in a cycle where we're just short cattle, just long-term trends because of a lot of culling over the last several years. And this becomes a really, really tight, supply. So really kind of interesting this week because we saw really this divergence. Cash started moving really, really high. And then we had this big kind of sell-off in the futures market. We're talking, $10 a hundredweight in the fed cattle. And really the fundamentals would support that, we are tight on the supplies, but the futures market we're selling off in what appears to be kind of just a lot of speculation about future policies that potentially come from the administration. And I think we're seeing a lot of this kind of emergence from really this supply or what we'd call fundamental analysis and really kind of this algorithmic trading start to rear its head. And we've seen that really through the most of 2026, really, really sharp movements on speculations of different policies. I think some of that has to do with where we were at in 2025 when we saw big movements in the market was kind of caught off guard with, policy announcements from President Trump. So I think some of those, headline speculation information that's being fed into algorithmic trading seems to be driving a lot of these sell-offs, which is a little bit frustrating because, we shouldn't see basis this wide. Even think about the June market where we're at, it's super wide right now. We shouldn't be seeing that wide given, how much we know about the supply situation.
And taking a deeper dive into the cattle market, a conversation that you've mentioned has resurfaced, packer concentration. And what is that meaning for our market?
Yeah, this was really on early of last week that there was a large conversation that back in November, President Trump once again announced that the Department of Justice would be investigating the packers for price manipulation. And really the argument there was that packers are exerting market power and therefore causing higher prices, retail prices for consumers. Retail prices have been kind of the battle drum for the administration. Affordability, beef was kind of caught up into that narrative, and really trying to get beef prices down for consumers has been, let's say, kind of a rallying point for the administration. So That was announced in November. The DOJ is aggressively looking at this. This isn't like a passive thing. Just different people have been subpoenaed and for information. So this is an active investigation. This isn't passive. Something will come out of this, whether there's proof, whether they find something or not. It definitely is active. So I think some of that when the attorney general gets up and starts talking about, things like beef in the market, this gets picked up as we were talking about earlier, just kind of the algorithmic trading and kind of gets brought down. So something to watch for, but, even if the DOJ did come out with something, how does that ultimately affect, the fundamental supply of cattle going through the market? It doesn't really, because supplies are what supplies are.
And you mentioned speculation while we were talking about fed cattle, and another term of speculation to talk about today when it comes to the market, increased quotas for imports. Is that something we're thinking might be happening?
Yeah, a lot of this has to do with, as remember also last fall, pretty much at the same time we were having this large conversation about just trade in general, and then particularly for the U.S. beef imports and really about beef lean trimmings as a way to try to combat basically culling in the cow market, right? So the idea is that if you're importing lean trimmings, then maybe we're not culling as many cows, which would drive down the cull cow price and basically force retention. And then we'd able to, rather than trimming a lot of the chucks or the rounds into 90s, that we would sell those products. So that really ignited the argument with Argentina. And really, Brazil has always been one of the largest contributors or importers of lean trimmings and other products to the United States, primarily in the form of lean trimmings. And so there was conversation. The president of the United States was meeting with Brazilian officials. And so the market got a little spooked there because last time the president met with someone from South America, it was the Argentinian president. There was shortly there was an announcement that they were going to, of course, import or increase beef import trimmings, and that ultimately saw a big sell-off in the cash market. Brazil is a little bit different story than Argentina, though. So there is some validity in why there might have been a sell-off, because Brazil has a much larger capability of supplying trimmings than Argentina does, just because of the sheer number of animals that they have. With China kind of restricting some of their beef imports, there's excess supply out there for Brazilian beef trimmings. Brazil has a pretty high tariff when it's coming into the United States. So the fact that they continue to be one of the largest importers in really what we call our other category, or other, because they don't have their own tariff quota, is pretty surprising. That just goes to show you the price differential between Brazilian prices and U.S. markets. The fact that they're able to grow, harvest, and then pay for the transportation plus the tariff, and they're still shipping product. It shows you the difference between Brazil and the United States.
Thinking of affordability, looking at our own markets, how are they looking?
Yeah, when you think about this, is really kind of the prime beef demand kind of months with Mother's Day that we had this past Sunday, and really kind of going into July. July 4th. These are our prime grilling seasons. Some of the retail prices have been a little bit sluggish just because we haven't had an extremely hot spring. It's been kind of up and down. There's been some hot days and there's been some cold days. And so people just haven't really, gotten really into full grilling season, being outside and really kind of getting together for more socials where you'd have, things like burgers and steaks and, all the fixings. And so that's kind of really slowed kind of boxed beef. And so when we think about like kind of what's driving the cattle complex, it's really been the feeder cattle, over the last several weeks that have been kind of pushing up the fed cattle price. The fed cattle price has been really trying to push up the boxed beef, but boxed beef hasn't done anything really remarkable. And that's because retail just has been sluggish. So this next month, I'll really be watching the boxed beef sales, just because this should be when we start to see a lot of the loin and the rib really start to carry the boxed beef. And then if we continue to have, strong ground beef demand that we can either get from imports or a cull cow market, or other forms of lean trimmings, then that should really kind of pull up the ground beef demand as well. So, steaks and burgers is generally what we tend to grow during summer.
And one more factor for us to talk about today as we're thinking about the market, labor concerns at packing plants. And what issues are you seeing?
Yeah, labor just tends to be a kind of revolving issue, especially in unionized plants. This has been something that, as we talked about in the past, that really last year, the last several years with Tyson plants down in Texas, that was the unionized plant, and about wages and affordability for workers. And JBS obviously had in Greeley, Colorado, had an extended shortage that kind of was terminated on kind of mixed grounds there. Really, it was kind of a 50-50 draw there. They got some concessions, but really just to kind of get the plant back up and running. And now we're hearing other kind of rumors about these things start to happen, voting, maybe staged walkouts, planned, but not a full-on strike at other plants, most notably in the northern plains of the Cargill plant up in Fort Morgan. So this news has kind of been slowly kind of percolating. It hasn't been fully broadcast. We were talking about JBS a lot, and the fact that Fort Morgan continues to kind of, potentially have these kind of rumblings of plant closure. Once again, that kind of indicates that, when we're in kind of these tight cattle supply markets, it's, labor, how much labor do we need, and who actually holds the upper hand in this negotiating, situation that we have when we're already kind of short cattle, and we're, do we bid up prices or do we kind of let people walk? So that's something I'll be watching, and I think will come to light more so in the next, couple weeks.
Elliott, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing controlling volunteer corn and a herbicide that is to be discontinued with K-State weed specialist Sarah Ganske. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Shelby.
Sarah, what fields do you see volunteer corn being a concern in?
So volunteer corn, quite frankly, is probably our number 2 weed in soybeans in the state of Kansas. It all starts back at harvest, right? A lot of it in terms of how we're setting the combine and just the corn either not making it into the combine or coming through the back end of the combine. And so then when we rotate to beans the next year, we've got a little bit of a problem. Typically when I think about volunteer corn and soybeans, not a huge deal. Select is great at controlling volunteer corn from that perspective. The problem is, as the volunteer corn gets larger, maybe it's kind of doesn't seem to be a problem at the time of that last post application, and then it comes on and it pops up above the canopy. That can be hard to control. Select does a good job, but obviously, as with all weeds, the larger the weed, the harder it is on the herbicide to try to get good control.
So what time frame for calling volunteer corn a weed is best for control?
So I think probably that early post timing is a good opportunity to get it. But also, I think we need to be just aware that there are some things we can do to help ourselves at planting. Probably things that include sulfentrazone. So thinking about like the Authority line of products would be good choices if you have fields that you suspect are going to have a volunteer corn problem. There's been just a little bit of research looking at chemical control of volunteer corn, and there's really not a lot of other great options in there. The other reason that volunteer corn sometimes becomes a conversation this time of year, Shelby, is let's say we planted our corn and then we got, crazy rain or hail or whatever, and now we're in a replant situation and we want to go back to corn in that same field. That is a different beast. For a variety of reasons, when we think about using Select, there is a replant interval between Select applications and planting corn again. So that makes Select not a great option. Typically, our corn hybrids are going to be resistant to Roundup or glyphosate, as well as Liberty or glufosinate. So those products aren't options. So really, we're left with Gramoxone or Paraquat. or something similar to that is probably the best choice in those situations.
At what point do you see controlling volunteer corn almost feeling impossible or very unlikely to be successful?
I mean, I've seen fields across the state, where the volunteer corn is like tasseling in the soybean field. Obviously, that's too late. Probably the biggest thing that's going to be a cutoff rather than the corn size is the soybean growth stage, right? As we think about a lot of our post herbicides on soybeans, we're going to cut those applications off. Depending on the product, maybe it's early flowering growth stages or 30 to 60 days before harvest, just depending on the product. So that's probably the biggest limitation in terms of like, when do we need to cut off control measures?
You mentioned maybe during corn harvest needing to take care of it for the previous season. What's the thing that you accidentally see growers maybe creating a problem for themselves for the next season?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not an expert in combine settings, Shelby, but I will tell you a little shameless self-promotion. We actually did an episode of our War Against Weeds podcast this fall in corn harvest time, just talking about setting combines to try to prevent volunteer corn control. So thinking about changes to the deck plates and other things that guys can change in their machines. So I would point listeners to that. It's probably a 45-minute episode of the War Against Weeds podcast where we talked all about how to try to prevent volunteer corn.
And as we're talking about chemicals, is there a discontinuation of one?
Yeah, so I mentioned Gramoxone when we were talking about a non-selective control for volunteer corn ahead of a replant situation. One of the things that has kind of come to light this spring is that Syngenta has decided to discontinue sales of Gramoxone. Okay. The cutoff there is the end of 2026, so December 31, 2026, or until existing supplies have been sold, whichever comes first. So the Paraquat that is in the marketplace is what we have. Now, when I first heard this, I saw people kind of waving their hands and getting kind of excited. I was like, well, but there's a bajillion generics, right? We have a handful of generics that we could choose from that better price, and a lot of guys are spraying anyway because they're better price, right? But as I started poking around and asking questions of some of my colleagues across the industry, I know at least one other company has already discontinued use of their Paraquat product. And the thing that, as I reflect on this more, Shelby, the reason I think that folks need to be paying attention to this more than maybe some folks are, is because Syngenta has been carrying the burden as the primary registrant for things like that required 3-year Paraquat handler training, right? So Syngenta's been carrying the financial burden for that. When other legal issues arise, Syngenta's been kind of the standard bearer and kind of leading the charge on those legal issues. And so as we think about Paraquat and its future, if we don't have opportunities for EPA mandated training, what does that mean in terms of legally spraying it and other companies being able to maintain those labels? I think that's a question folks need to sit back and think about. I think we need to think about how much more stringent and slower herbicide, even re-registrations have become. And when we think about Paraquat, it is up for re-registration. It's got about another decade before it goes up for re-registration. And we would potentially, have another opportunity for the EPA to try to make some more serious changes to the label. So yeah, it's a great product. It's a super important product, especially as we think about our folks out in Western Kansas trying to control weeds and wheat stubble situations, whether that's fallow or just, post-harvest. But I think it's maybe a little naive to assume that we're going to have it forever. And so, this is a good opportunity for folks to sit down and start thinking about, if this does completely go away, what am I going to do? As we look around, there's not a lot of great alternatives on the marketplace right now. There's things that we can put into that slot, but, dollar per percent weed control, it's not going to be as effective as Gramoxone is now. So I just think it's a good time to kind of have this conversation with folks and to think about what do we need to do to make sure we can still control weeds effectively in the event that this product does completely go away.
As we are thinking about this, then you mentioned maybe not as good as alternatives, but what are a few options producers might have?
So when we think about a non-selective contact herbicide, the closest comparison on the market today is glufosinate. Now, folks in Western Kansas are going to look at me and say glufosinate is the pits, unless we have a year like last year when it's actually humid in a lot of parts of our state where it's normally not. The other thing, we'll tell you about glufosinate, we know that it needs sunlight and it needs high humidity to work well. We know it has those limitations. I'm not saying it's a one-for-one replacement. I'm saying it's the closest thing we've got available today. Other things to think about are some of the PPO inhibiting herbicides. So those would be our group 14 herbicides, particularly things like Sharpen. The active ingredient in Sharpen is going to come off patent here in the near future. And so that will change some things in the pricing of that product. And so, combinations of glufosinate and Sharpen can be very effective in a wide range of environments. So that's actually something that my team is looking into a little bit more this summer, is looking at some of these PPO inhibitors in combination with glufosinate or Liberty types of products to see if we can get more consistent control out of Liberty, because that's a big complaint that farmers here in Kansas have about glufosinate is just consistency due to that environmental interaction.
Is there another chemical that's also being discontinued?
There is another herbicide that Syngenta is discontinuing. So, you guys know it's kind of an interesting time in the economic side for all of these ag input companies, as well as for our farmers. And so Syngenta's been looking at their portfolio and trying to get themselves, positioned in a good business position. And so the other product that they have decided to stop sale of is Flexstar GT. So Flexstar is fomeciphin or Reflex. The folks that I hear using that product most, honestly, are my cotton guys, kind of down in South Central Kansas. It has some limitations for corn rotations in Western Kansas that make it, not as popular out there. But Flexstar GT, the full name Flexstar GT 3.5, that's the product that's being discontinued. So it's that combination of fomeciphin plus the GT indicates glyphosate. So that product will be going away as well. And actually that date is June 30th of 2026 or until supplies last.
Sarah, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Once again, that was K-State weed specialist Sarah Ganske. I will link her War Against Weeds podcast as well as Agronomy E-Update articles on these topics in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show discussing pollinator strips with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, what is a pollinator strip?
Yeah, it's just an area. Generally, it's in low or marginal farm ground areas. So on the edge of your farm, if you think about that, you might allow some native grasses or forbs to grow up in those areas, and it can have a lot of benefits for the water on your farm ground, but also other benefits that we can chat about.
So how is this different than a riparian border?
Yeah, it's very similar to a riparian border. Riparian borders are generally up against bodies of water. So things like creeks and streams, that would be a riparian border or a riparian corridor. A pollinator strip can be anywhere on the landscape. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be adjacent to those water sources, but allowing these native plants to be there can provide a lot of benefits for our water and our water resources.
And what have been some of those benefits that you've seen?
Yeah, on the water side, things like holding back sediment and uptaking nutrients. It can allow water to slow down so you can have more infiltration into the agriculture ground. And we know how valuable water is. So those can be some of the benefits to the farm ground on the water side of things.
Called pollinator strips, so I'm assuming they're beneficial for pollinators as well?
Yeah, so one of the really big things that they do is they can increase the number of pollinators that we have on the landscape. And so that can increase our yields just by having more of those invertebrates that can help with pollination. They can also host a lot of different types of invertebrate predators that can help us naturally with pests. And so things like parasitoid wasps or predatory beetles can help to naturally go out and reduce some of those pests that we might see in our crop fields.
So how are those wasps and beetles reducing those pests?
Yeah, so parasitoid wasps are neat individuals. They go out and they sting pests and they'll lay their eggs actually inside of the pest. And then the larvae will hatch and they'll consume the pest from the inside out. And so they're going to kill that pest that's out there. Predatory beetles are going to go attack pests and reduce the amount of pests that we see in our fields. And so in those ways, they're just helping to reduce the abundance or numbers of these, invertebrate pests that we might see in crop fields.
And thinking of pollinators, one of my personal favorites, probably because they're pretty, monarch butterflies. Are those something that these strips also benefit?
Sure, yeah, monarchs love these areas. If you have milkweed, there are lots of native milkweeds, but if you have milkweed present in these pollinator strips, you might see some monarchs, and that can be really beneficial. Monarchs actually migrate really long distances, and so these can be important stops for them along the way to make sure they have enough food to get where they're going.
And you mentioned that these pollinator strips can be anywhere around the land, and so how do they go about getting, per se, established?
Yeah, we generally would put them in areas that are low or marginal production. So, you see them a lot on the edge of farmlands or areas where we maybe don't have the most productive ground. And so, it's as simple as, kind of letting these things be taken over by nature. You might need some management actions, things like fire or mowing can really help to encourage the types of plants that we want. We want to have native grasses and native forbs, or if we can have those types of plants, that would be best. But just allowing anything to build up kind of gives opportunities for these pollinators and the pest predators, and then also wildlife like to use these habitats as well.
How do wildlife use them?
Yeah, wildlife can use them for lots of different areas. And so they can be really important bedding areas. If we think about things like deer, birds like quail, maybe pheasants in some parts of the state could really utilize these habitats. And then, a lot of songbirds love to be in these, they're called edge type habitats. And a lot of different songbirds like to be in the habitats for those reasons. So all kinds of different ways. They can also provide food for some of the different wildlife we like to see. So they can have a lot of different benefits, especially if they're surrounding farm ground. And it can be a great way for wildlife to use our area and keep them out of our crops.
Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.